Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Rabbi.
So nice to see all of you.
Good morning, Rabbi.
I appreciate so much everybody joining me here this morning in our Boca Jewish Center Zoom room. And for those of you who are joining us via YouTube or via Facebook Live, it's wonderful to welcome everybody to this week's edition of Insights into the Weekly Parsha, our action jam-packed Parsha, Parshas Lecha. We are at the beginning of Sefer Bereshis. This week's shir has been generously sponsored anonymously to commemorate the upcoming yahrzeit of Chaya Sarah Bas Shmuel Yaakov. Her neshama should have an aliyah. So let's get started with what we have a lot to learn and a very special and a very important message for us to take to our hearts and to appreciate and apply to our lives. This past Tuesday night, for those who follow sports, and knowing that the following of sports today is very different than it was when things were back to the way, what we called normal. Please God, when things will be in the new normal, those who love sports and follow sports, it's not going to be about bubbles or specific locations, so on and so forth. But the sports storyline of Tuesday night is that after 32 years of drought, after not winning a world championship, the Los Angeles Dodgers were crowned world champions again. And I am mindful, and I was just a youngster when Orel Hershiser and Kirk Gibson were winning championships in 1988 for the Dodgers. There are many storylines that emerged. The patience, the amount of time that you wait for something, commit towards something, an effort that you are utterly training for constantly, vigilantly, regularly. That's the storyline of the 32-year drought that was ended in the World Championship celebrated by the Los Angeles Dodgers. And as I mentioned, there are a number of storylines that emerged. One, of course, which could be a conversation in and of itself, the fact that a player, a star player, was diagnosed with coronavirus in the middle of the game, and then he's taken out from the game, and he is put in isolation where he should have remained, and then he comes back onto the field to celebrate with his teammates. A public and brazen dismissal of the pandemic and the terrific and awful emergence of just horrific public disregard for people that are vulnerable. He was sitting next to somebody who was a survivor of cancer over a number of years, and just how a celebrity, a personality who is held in high regard and high esteem, could be so brazen, so bolden in the face of something that is just so important for us to be mindful. When you're a celebrity, when you are a public person, when you are an idol, that many people tend to, and I don't mean that in the ugly way, but when people look up, children look up to sports personalities and others, you have a responsibility to be the best that you need to be, because the messaging that you share is so significant. And so I felt so sad that what was tainted in the efforts for which they celebrated their championship, I know others don't necessarily feel that way, but I certainly do, that there was a tremendous asterisk that celebrated their championship insofar that there was tremendous public disregard for a pandemic and how many people model themselves after sports celebrities and players. And to see that happen was just so unbelievably and utterly unsettling. That's one storyline. As I mentioned, could be a topic in and of itself. But there's another storyline, and this is kind of what gets us to our topic this morning that I want to share. And that is that the Tampa Bay Rays, who was the opposing team to the Dodgers, for those of you who are not sports fans, so you're going to get a good little lesson here in sports, and certainly this most recent World Series. So they had a pitcher that was pitching for them. Blake Snell is his name. And he's a very accomplished pitcher, very successful. He was shutting down the Dodgers offense through the first 5 innings of the game 6 of the World Series. He had allowed just 1 hit and 0 runs, which is enough for the Rays to get a 1-0 lead, in which was a must-win elimination game, which if they would have won, there would have been a game 7. So he got out. He got into the 6th inning, got the first out, and that was when things changed. The manager of their team, a guy by the name of Kevin Cash, he made a decision that will be second-guessed actually for the rest of his career. He took this pitcher Snell out of the game. Now, you have to understand what that means. Is he took him out of the game when he was having one of the most dominant World Series starts ever in the history of the World Series, at least for a pitcher who couldn't even get through 6 innings. As he exited the game after just over 5 innings, he had 9 strikeouts, no walks, and just 2 hits that were allowed. He was really on par and on pace to bring his team to the success that he needed to. Now, the Dodgers came back, they took the lead, and of course, they never looked back, and they clinched the series. 32-year drought comes to an end. And what this obviously has brought into conversation, and I'm certainly not offering my commentary on sports and whether it was the right decision or was the wrong decision. Of course, there are statistics and mathematics and considerations that are far beyond anything that I really claim to understand. But the notion of finishing what you started, you began something, you started something, you were headed towards the goal, you were committed to it in every possible way, and you were being successful in whatever it was that you were doing. And in this case, you're pitching a ball game that seems to be that it was going very well. It was an elimination game. If you win the game, you have a chance for the seventh game, which would have given you a chance to win the World Series. And if you lose, you go home. So finishing what you started is so significant in Chazal. It's so important in general. And it's very important to our Parsha, which we're going to learn a very important lesson. But the way we're going to jump off learning this lesson this morning is actually taking ourselves back a little bit in Sefer Devarim. At the very beginning of the Sefer of Parshas Yaakov in Sefer Devarim, so there's an interesting pasuk, and Rashi explains what this verse means, and it's going to highlight what is a very necessary lesson for us to learn here in Parshas Lecha. Sefer Devarim in Parshas Yaakov. So Moshe Rabbeinu teaches that we should do kol ha-mitzvah, all of the mitzvah, where the pasuk tells us, kol ha-mitzvah she'anochi mitzavcha hayom tishmeruna la'asos. All of the mitzvah that you're commanded to do, tishmerun la'asos. So Rashi explains this to mean that it's just this idea that a person should finish the mitzvah that you began. You started to do a mitzvah. Don't put the mitzvah down. Don't leave it for somebody else to complete it. Finish the job. As a person should finish it. As credit for the mitzvah only goes to the person who completes it, meaning all of the mitzvah, kol ha-mitzvah, all of the mitzvah. Now, as proof to this notion, to this idea, Rashi quotes famously the Medrash Tanchuma, which quotes a pasuk from Sefer Yehoshua, from the book of Joshua, where Bnei Israel are described as having been being the ones who brought up the Atzmos Yosef, having brought up the bones of Joseph to Eretz Yisrael for burial, for Kfuras Yisrael. As the pasuk says, "Ves Atzmos Yosef asher helu v'nei Yisrael mimitzrayim kovru b'Shechem." We know that Yosef was buried in Shechem. Who brought his bones up in Sefer Yehoshua? Who do we understand were the ones who are credited as the ones who brought up the bones of Yosef? It's Bnei Israel. So that's troubling. Why? Because we know that it wasn't Bnei Israel that brought up the bones of Moshe Rabbeinu. We know that it was of Yosef Atzadik, but rather we know that it was Moshe Rabbeinu who brought the bones up. As the pasuk tells us in the very beginning of Parshas Bishalach, the pasuk tells us, "Vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef imo," that it was Moshe Rabbeinu who took Joseph's bones with him. Why? Ki hashpea hishbia es bnei Yisrael leimor pakoid yifkoid elokim eschem va'alisem es atzmoisem mizeschem. Itechem. Moshe Rabbeinu took Yosef Hatzadik's bones with him. Why? Because Yosef Hatzadik, so he had told Bnei Israel that Hashem is going to for sure remember you. He's going to take you out of Mitzrayim, but don't leave my bones down here. Take them up with you to Eretz Yisrael. Bury me in Eretz Yisrael. That's what he said to Bnei Israel, said to his brothers, said to his children, his grandchildren, his descendants. So who is the one who took his bones? Parshas Bishalach, Vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef imo. It was Moshe Rabbeinu who takes the bones of Yosef. So what's the pshat in the pasuk in Sefer Yehoshua? Ves atzmos Yosef as asher helu et bnei Yisrael mimitzrayim kover b'Shechem. It's Bnei Israel are the ones that took the bones of Yosef. It was Moshe Rabbeinu who was the one that took the bones of Yosef. However, what we understand from this Rashi, Parshas Yaakov, Kol HaMitzvah, since Moshe Rabbeinu did not complete the task, why didn't he complete the task? He didn't complete the task because he was not allowed to enter into Eretz Yisrael, which is going to be very significant to a very important understanding of this whole episode. So the credit of carrying the Atzmos Yosef, of carrying the bones, is given to those who finished the job of burial. Bnei Israel, not Moshe Rabbeinu. Those are the ones who are given the credit of doing this mitzvah. They buried Yosef in Shechem. They brought his bones to Eretz Canaan, to Eretz Yisrael, and they're the ones who get the credit. Afal Pichein, even though it was Moshe Rabbeinu who brought the bones up, no, they're the ones who finished the job. And therefore, the one who finished the job, in the case of the World Series, Lahavdon, in the case of bringing the Atzmos Yosef, so it was Bnei, so it wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, the message, of course, is abundantly clear. What we understand from this Chazal is that finishing a mitzvah is crucial. utterly crucial to its undertaking. As Rashi says, when a person begins, when you start a mitzvah, gomeroisa, you have to finish the mitzvah. Don't put it down. Don't leave it for somebody else. She'ena nikras hamitzvah ella al shema goimra. Why? Because the mitzvah is attributed to the one and only one who completes this task. That's what Rashi explains. That's what we understand from this story. That's what we understand why it is Bnei Yisrael gets credit for the Atzmas Yosef, even though the pasuk tells us very clearly that it's Moshe Rabbeinu, it's Bnei Yisrael. Now, what's interesting about just this whole story here is why is it, we wonder, is that the Medrash Tanchuma chooses Moshe's failure to complete Yosef's burial as an example of one who starts but does not complete a mitzvah, right? Why is this a question? Because Moshe Rabbeinu, he had no choice in this matter. He would have gladly been happy to complete this mitzvah had he been given permission to enter Eretz Yisrael, which means the only reason why he was not given the ability to bring out Atzmas Yosef to Eretz Yisrael is very simply because of the fact that he was not allowed to enter into Eretz Yisrael. But if he would have been given permission to enter into Eretz Yisrael, he would have been very happy to do so. But he wasn't given that permission. So since he's not given the permission to enter Eretz Yisrael, so he's held back. Now, to the contrary, which we have to think about the general meta principle here, the klal gadol, which is that, let's just say, for example, a person intends to do a mitzvah. You have all of that which is necessary to carry out what you intend to do, to be mekayim, to fulfill a mitzvah. But then there's a concept called onus. What's onus? Duress, extenuating circumstances. You didn't intend not to complete the task, but there's an onus. There was something that happened. There was some extenuating circumstance that came up. So you failed to do the mitzvah, but that person, Chazal tell us with this principle, is nonetheless given the credit as if they've actually done the mitzvah, right? Which means if you're in a category of an onus, you didn't intentionally choose not to fulfill and complete the task, but rather something happened, something was an extenuating circumstance that it presented itself, and so therefore because of that, and only because of that, that's the reason why you are unable to fulfill the task. So what does Chazal say of such a person? That if your intention was to complete the task and it was just something that was extenuating, that was not planned, and you didn't intentionally try not to complete the task, so Chazal gives you credit as if you have actually completed the task, as if you've actually even done the mitzvah. So then, of course, we wonder why the Medrash Tanchuma gives this as an example. Wouldn't it be better to use an example of someone who willingly abandons a mitzvah? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't willingly abandon this mitzvah. He would have been very, very happy to bring out Atzmas Yosef into Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Canaan. He just wasn't allowed to. He just wasn't able to do it. So how do we understand that? So there's an 18th century Italian rabbi, a poet as well, lived for some time in Bosnia, certainly lived in Yerushalayim. His name is Rabbi David Pardo. And among other things, he authored a commentary on the Sifra, on Sefer Vayikra, but he also wrote a Sefer called the Maskil David. Wrote it in the year 1760 in Venice. Maskil LeDavid is a super commentary on Rashi on the Torah. And in this Sefer and in this writing, Maskil LeDavid, Rabbi David Pardo, he answers this question in a very important way. Of course, we know the rule is that a person who's an ones, that person who has extenuating circumstances that are presented before him, so of course that person gets credit for his good intentions. You can't hold somebody responsible, or somebody was negligent and derelict if they didn't intend to not finish the task. If a person has good intentions, even though we say that the pathway to Gehenna is paved with those who have good intentions, that's not a Jewish concept. We believe that when a person has good intentions, assuming that there isn't something that a person chooses not to complete the task, a person's good intentions carries the day. And therefore, of course, the din is that a person who's an ones, a person gets credit for his good intentions. However, if one brings the extenuating circumstances upon himself or herself by their own poor judgment, their poor choices, okay, so then the situation does not qualify as an ones. That's a different story, which means it's extenuating circumstances, that's true, but the extenuating circumstances are circumstances that you brought upon yourself, that you were negligent and derelict in what you should have prevented from those extenuating circumstances from happening. Now, if something just happens by chance upon you, so that's a one category. But if there's something that you could have done to prevent from that extenuating circumstance from happening, so that it's not a category of onus, and therefore you do not get the reward. And so he explains that in Moshe Rabbeinu's case, and actually on his level, and every tzaddik, every person is judged on their own level, Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, being no different. So Moshe Rabbeinu sinned, we know, and therefore was denied entry into Eretz Yisrael. And Mei Meriva, the speaking to the rock, the striking of the rock, everybody's familiar with that story. because this was, so to speak, he writes, Moshe's own doing, so it does not qualify as an onus. It's not considered that it was an extenuating circumstance, that he didn't have what to do it. So accordingly, he began the mitzvah of Yosef's burial, but he did not complete it due to his own subsequent actions, not due to onus. A true onus, for example, however, I would say, does get credit for good intentions to do a mitzvah, which remained unrealized. Even though he couldn't finish the job, he gets schar, he gets reward. It's as if he did it. But not when the onus is diminished, is evaporated because of something that you could have done, something you should have changed. The example of Moshe Rabbeinu not completing this task is a perfect example, actually. Even though we would think that the Tanchuma should have chosen another personality who actively, intentionally chooses to go another direction and take their mitzvah responsibility lightly and not to do it, we would think that Moshe Rabbeinu is not the perfect example. But in fact, says Maskim David that in fact he is a perfect example, because the idea, the notion, the principle of finishing a mitzvah is crucial to its undertaking, applies precisely to this kind of self-induced failure to complete. We have to learn how to complete the job, finish the task. If somebody, however, failed to complete or even start due to circumstances truly beyond their control, then that person would get credit for their good intentions. That person would have not purposely intended for them not to fulfill and complete the task. That's a different story. So halach allows there to be a place called an oines. There's circumstance, it's extenuating, it's a situation where a person had no control, and therefore that person, even though they started but were unable to complete it, so they get the reward, they get the schar as if they completed the task. But in a situation where a person brings that extenuating circumstance upon themselves, so that's not the same rule, that's not the same law, and therefore the dinim are different. And therefore that's not considered a classic case of onus. And in this case, writes Rabbi David Pardo, that this is something that he brought upon himself in that sense. He sinned, and because of that, he's going to say, I'm not allowed in Eretz Yisrael. Well, the reason why you're not allowed in Eretz Yisrael, according to his commentary, is because of something that, of course, he did. That's a punishment. Of course, we know that the Parsha Pasuk tells us very, very clearly. And so since that's the case, this is the perfect example. And this brings us to our jam-packed Parsha this week in Parshas Lech. The idea of finishing the job and the consequence of not finishing the job, and how far it is that a person has to go to try to finish the job and do whatever it is that is necessary to complete the task. Obviously, it goes without saying, this is part of our hakdama, part of our introduction, if something impedes your way, stands in your path, makes it difficult as an obstacle for you to be successful, it's a different story. But if you brought it upon yourself and you take extreme ownership for why you've failed to reach the finish line, the destination, so you have yourself and only yourself to blame. And what we try to do when we learn Parshios together, we learn Chumash together, we study Mamari Chazal, we go through Shas and Poskim, we try to look at this not as singularly as an intellectual pursuit outside of it being an opportunity for us to grow in Ruchnius, for us to better ourselves, perfect our spiritual well-being. What is it that I can learn from these lessons? How can I apply them to my life? How do I take extreme ownership for things that I've started, failed to complete? Why have I failed to complete that? And am I held responsible? Do I hold myself truly responsible for failing to complete the task? If I knew that I started something, and as hard as I worked towards something, and somebody else is going to get the credit for what it is that I started, that's very, very painful. But it's only painful if you're not going to get credit for it. If you're going to get credit for it, then it's not as painful. It's not as painful because you're going to get the credit for it. But the reason why you're not going to get the credit for it is simply because of the fact that you have self-imposed your inability to get credit for it. That's the example that we're learning here. Bnei Yisrael gets credit for the Atzmos Yosef, not Moshe Rabbeinu, with this commentary that explains it's self-imposed, self-inflicted. When a person brings it upon themselves, that's the reason why they're unable to complete the task. They don't get the reward. They don't get mentioned. They don't even get honorable mention. We just are asking as a question, like, how could it be? There's a pasuk in Chumash that says that he brought the bones, but he wasn't the one that gets the credit for it. So we try to understand what Chazal is trying to teach us. And that's what brings us to our Parsha. Because when we understand what it means to take responsibility to finish the job, how many things have we started? How many things have we planned to start? What are the things that have stood in our way, that stand in our path, that impede our growth? Sometimes it's true that there's circumstances that stand in our way that don't make it possible for us to achieve what it is we've wanted to achieve. But more often than not, that's not the case. They're self-inflicted wounds. They're self-inflicted impediments. They're things that stand in our way that we've created to stand in our way, and therefore we're not able to reach the goal. We have to have our eye on the prize. We have to see the big picture, and we have to be very deliberate and very precise and very committed emotional, physical, social, whatever it is that a person needs to do to commit themselves to finish the job, So that's an idea from our Parsha that I really think this is going to drill this point very deeply, deeply down, and hopefully into our hearts and into our souls as well. So we know that our Parsha begins Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'me'aditecha u'mebeis avicha el ha'aretz asher areka. That the Rebbeinu Shalom says to Avram, you should go from your land, your birthplace, from your father's house. And this is a very important part. U'mebeis avicha el ha'aretz asher areka, to the land that I'm going to show you. I'm not going to tell you where to go. And of course, there's so much commentary about just Lech and Lech Lecha and Asher Areka. In fact, some Sfarim explain and wonder, why is it that he went to Mitzrayim? How could he go back to Mitzrayim? There's a famine in the land. He goes to Egypt. He brings his wife. He brings his family. How could he bring himself back to Mitzrayim? Of course, he knows what happened to his people in what's going to be predicted in the future, right? What's going to happen in the land of Mitzrayim? And the answer is Asher Areka, because at the end of the day, he wasn't given specific coordinates, and that not being given specific coordinates is essential to our learning here. The moment Avram Avinu steps up and leaves behind a legacy, not only of his land, of his birthplace. Lots of people leave the land. A lot of people leave their birthplace. You're born in a certain place, you relocate to another location. That happens to lots and lots of people, most people actually. But here's where things get interesting. You should Lech Lecha u'mibeis avicha. You should leave the legacy of your father. What's the legacy of your father? What does it mean to leave your father's house? So this is a moment that's extraordinary. This huge amount of meaning, which I think sometimes gets very, very easily overlooked. What does it mean that he should leave Lech Lecha u'mibeis avicha? Should leave his father's house. He's leaving his land. He's leaving his birthplace. What's shot his father's house? Is there an influence of his father? Is there a lifestyle of the father? Was there a connection to his father that we're worried that he's going to maintain? There's no emails, there's no text messaging, there's no tweeting. There's no connection that was maybe if once he's leaving his land, he's leaving his birthplace. Okay, good enough, that's it, it's finished. He's not going to have the same connection with his father. So this moment that Avram Avinu steps up and he leaves not just his birthplace and his land, but he leaves the legacy of his father is a moment of extraordinary meaning. And the question is, let's back it up a little bit. What do we know about Avram Avinu's father? Because it's very important to think about what we know and what we don't know, what we assume and suppose that we know, and what we're going to learn about Avram Avinu's father, which is a lesson that we very often overlook. We don't think about Avram's father, right? Because we just focus our attention beginning with the first of our avos, the first of our patriarchs, Avraham Avinu. But what do we know about Avraham's father? First of all, what was his name? His name was Terach, of course, right? Some of us are aware. So what's our opinion of Terach? What do we know about him? What do we think about him? What's our opinion about him? So it's true, more than anything maybe, he's the father of our patriarch. He's the father of the first of our avos. Imagine you're the fathers. The Mishnah in Perkei Avos says, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is extolling the praises of his Talmidim, he explains of Rav Yossi, Ashrei Yoladato, praise it and blessed is his mother and his father, blessed and praised are those who gave birth, his mother who gave birth to him. So imagine the father, how many parents are so proud of the accomplishments of their children? I met the parent of a celebrity just about 10 days ago, and all they were telling me about was their son, and with good reason. They were expressing their gratitude to the Ribbon Shalom. And actually, this son, who's a celebrity, he didn't come from nowhere. It came from his parents. So what do we know? The first thing we know is our opinion, of course, is that he's the father of our patriarch. That shouldn't be overlooked. But it's equally true that our associations with him seem always to be very negative, right? Who do we think that Terach was? Our view of him, of course, is very colored by an episode that appears only in the Medrash, that many of us don't necessarily realize. Not in Chumash, it's in the Medrash. We have an image of little Avraham in Terach's idol shop, right? All these little children that come back from school and they know Parshas Lech Lecha me'artzecha. You're going to see the children are going to tell Dvar Torah's Divrei Torah at the Shabbos table, probably Shabbos, and there was little Avram, who's a little boy chick. Yeah, and he was in Terach, his father's idol shop, and he's smashing idols, right? But even in the absence of this legend or this Medrash, so the Navi actually tells us very, very clearly, very explicitly. If you look at Perek Chaf Daled, chapter 24, Pasuk Beis, verse number 2 in Sefer Yoshua, so the Pasuk tells us we don't have to go too far. It's in Tanakh. Vayomer Yoshua el kol that Yeshua said to all of the people, Koyamar Hashem Elokei Yisrael. So said Hashem. So what did he say? Be'ever hanar yoshvav seichem me'olam terach avi Avram v'avinochor v'yavdu. Here it is. V'yavdu Elohim acherim. You should know that from the earliest time, there was a man by the name of Terach, who was the father of Avram Avinu. Here you have Yeshua, who is remembering his history, going through a little bit of lineage, and he's saying that Avram had his father, and his father's name was Terach. He was the father of Nochor. And they served other gods. V'yavdu Elohim acherim. Pasuk Beis, Perik Chav Dalet. That Terach was an idolater, it's undisputed. That's how we've colored our image and interpretation and knowledge of who Terach was. But perhaps there's more to Terach than what meets the eye. And this is the lesson that is so powerful in every capacity. There's going to be one specific example. And for those who are living in Eretz Yisrael and those who dream to live in Eretz Yisrael, this is going to be for sure right up your alley and perfect for you. But this is perfect for everybody, because if you're not dreaming to live in Eretz Yisrael, you should be dreaming to live in Eretz Yisrael. And you should at the very least be struggling as to when you're going to move, make aliyah to move to Eretz Yisrael. But this isn't only true with this specific example. This is true of all examples and all mitzvos, all things that are of value, all things that are of virtue, everything that needs, without interruption, our utter commitment to the task, no matter what it is. So let's understand what this is more than what meets the eye about Terach. So let's begin with that, which is, so where is Avram Avinu from? Right? Anybody remember? Where was Avram Avinu from? So he grew up in a place called Or Kasdim. So where's Or Kasdim? Like, we know these biblical names, but where's Or Kasdim? So it's on the eastern side of the Arabian desert. Yeah? So how does he end up? If he's all the way on the eastern side of the Arabian desert, how does he end up so far away into Eretz Yisrael? He gets himself to Eretz Canaan. And the land that will become known, of course, as Eretz Yisrael. It's Canaan. He's all the way far east, and he's traveling. He finds himself in Canaan, where there are no other places, locations that he would find himself destined to go. The land that becomes Eretz Yisrael. And if you read the Psukim closely, so we'll see that the Ribono Shel Olam obviously never actually tells Avraham where to go. As I mentioned earlier, why did he go to Mitzrayim? How could he go to Mitzrayim? What do you mean, how could he go to Mitzrayim? He was never told explicitly where to go. So he had free reign. You put your coordinates into your GPS because you put point A to point B. Imagine you're traveling somewhere and I've got no point B. You could just simply go wherever you want to go. So where would you go? That's a good around the Shabbos table question. If you could go wherever you want to go, where would you go? Where would you go? You have an hour, you have 2 hours, you have a month. You can go wherever you want to go. The Ribono Shel Olam does not tell Avram Avinu where to go. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech, Lecha, you should go Asher Areka. What does that mean? To the place that I'm going to show you. Where's the place you're going to show me? What does that mean? That's ambiguous. That's not clear. And so therefore, there was a tremendous amount of opportunity. He could have gone anywhere. He's on the eastern side of the Arabian desert, and now he's in Eretz Canaan. He's not Eretz Yisrael. So what does that mean? Now, Avram had been living in Haran in the north. So in that northeastern part. So Hashem tells him to pick up and go without hesitation. He gathers his family, goes straight to Canaan. Now keep in mind, again, no destination. And here's what's fascinating. As soon as Avram Avinu arrives in Eretz Yisrael, so what does the Ribono Shel Olam tell him? This is so important. Hashem says to him, appears to him, and says, L'zarecha aten es ha'aretz hazot. I will, this is your place. I am going to give this land, because you've chosen correctly. This is it. I'm going to give it to your descendants. I'm going to give it to your children. I'm going to give it to your grandchildren. I'm going to give it to your great-grandchildren. It's not disputed. Eretz Yisrael belongs to Bnei Yisrael. L'zarecha etein es ha'aretz hazos. Because when Avraham Avinu arrives in Eretz Yisrael, Artzeinu HaKadosh, and our holy beloved Eretz Yisrael, the Ribono Shel Olam affirms that he made the right decision. He punched in his own GPS coordinates, and he did so correctly. He finds himself in Eretz Yisrael, and the Ribono Shel Olam b'chvodo u'v'atzmo says, you chose correctly. You are in the right place. This is the land that I'm going to give to your children, your grandchildren, your doris, your generations to follow. Your descendants, your children, Am Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, Klal Yisrael. So how does he do it? How did he know which coordinates to plug in. How did he know where he was supposed to go? Was it by chance? Would it be that the Ribono Shel Olam would have said that if he would have ended up in another location? Oh, this is the place that you chose to go here? Okay, nice selection. Of course not. It was the destiny that it should be. Eretz Yisrael is, without hesitation, without doubt, without question, a land that is intricately and intimately connected to Eretz Yisrael, to the Bnei Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, synonyms, one and the same. Is it because by chance that he chooses this place? No. You chose correctly. So the question, of course, is how does he do it? How does Avram Avinu know exactly where he has to go? It wasn't like a slam dunk, so it would seem. If you roll the clock back, roll the tape back, and he's told to leave, so he's going to leave. So where should he go? He's the whole world to go. Why does he choose this place? How does he know exactly where to go? So the answer appears in a pasuk we actually didn't, that is not in our Parsha. It's a pasuk that appears in a pasuk that we read at the end of last week's Parsha, in Parshas Noach. You know, we're so fully consumed with and utterly focused on in Parshas Noach, the world's destruction, the Mabul, the flood, and the emergence from the Teva and the rebuilding of the world in the aftermath of Noach's emergence from the ark, from the Teva. But at the end of the Parsha, we're going through all of the lineage and the descendants and all of the names, which for some are very hard to pronounce. And you go through all the names. But then, if you look in Chumash, at the end of last week's Parsha, when you juxtapose these themes, you're going to see that the answer is literally right here. Because how it was that Avram Avinu was able to know where to go, and the Ribono Shel Olam puts a stamp of approval on that. And that is why we are connected to Eretz Yisrael. This is the reason, this is the Parsha, the Bris Bein HaBesarim, Parshas Lecha, and in this moment, but it's not from Parshas Lecha. If you look in Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, chapter 11, verse, no one should have chapter 11, but for this learning, chapter 11, verse 31. Look at this pasuk. You look for it after the class if you look on your own. Vayik, for those who are following, Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Vayikach Terach es Avram beno. Terach took Avram, his son, but he didn't only take his son, he took his son, Ves Lot ben Haran. He took Lot, the son of Haran, Ben Beno, his grandson, and the Ace Sarai Kaloso, and he took Sarai, he took the wife of Avram, we know, Ashes Avram Beno, the wife of his son, Vayetzu itam me'or Kazdim, and they left Or Kazdim. Now, when they left Or Kazdim, where were they going? What does it mean they left Or Kazdim? They left Vayetzu itam me'or Kazdim lo leches arza Canaan. They were on their way to go to Canaan. They were on their way to go to Eretz Yisrael. Now, it would be very nice if the pasuk ended right there. Of course, we know that that's not when Avram Avinu arrives in Canaan, and he does not arrive there with his father Terach. Because the verse continues, Vayavo ad Choran vayeshevu sham. They were on their way to Canaan, and they came as far as Haran, as Choran, and they settled there. Now, why didn't they get to the destination? Why did they stop? Did they need a pit stop to pick up some snacks to retank their fuel tank in their automobile, which of course they didn't have? So why did they, if they were, the coordinates are told to us, there are no extra words in Chumash. Vayetzu itam, it should be that you would think Vayetzu itam me'or Kazdim and Vayavo ad Charan vayeshvu sham. They left Or Kazdim, they went to Charan, and they went and they stayed there. That's where they dwelled. That's where they settled. Vayeshvu sham does not mean that they took a pit stop. That the yeshiva Vayeshvu sham means that they settled there. They took out their tarps, they took out their tents, they settled shop. That is where they dwelled. That's where they settled. So why does the Torah have to tell us that where were they going? They left Me'or Kazdim lo leches arza Canaan. It's like blaring. It's unbelievable. Ad Choron v'yeshvu sham. But they came as far as Choron. That's where they went. So what we see here is that Avram Avinu was not the first person to desire to go to Eretz Yisrael. He was not the first person to want to go on Nefesh B'Nefesh flight to make Aliyah, Lahavdil. The first person who wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael was Terach. That's what the pasuk tells us. No, end of Parshas Noach. Vayetzu itamar kazdim lechas arzu Canaan. The fact that they ended up settling vayavo ad Charan vayeshavu sham. That's we're going to have to see what that means. That's where they were ultimately settling. Now, why that happens, we don't know. Canaan was his destination from the moment his family leaves or Kasdim. That's where they wanted to go. He just never made it there. Now, for whatever the reason, we're not given reasons. There's a lot of different probably explanations as to why that's true. But, and there's certainly a different drush that is part and parcel to this, which I'll just parenthetically just mention, is that you see sometimes when you're on a mission, when you're on a path, when you're on a roadway, and sometimes we get thrust off to the side. We put ourselves into situations where we get distracted and we never keep our eyes on the prize. And if we do, it's in the back of our minds. It's on the back burner and we forget about it. Whatever reason, he gets stuck in Haran. But that was never his final destination. You ever get on an airplane and you're taking a non-direct flight. You're stopping. What is your final destination? Yeah, the first stop is here. The final destination is here. That was not the final destination. He was taking a flight to Eretz Yisrael, Lahavdil, with a stopover. His final destination was not Haran, it was Eretz Yisrael. His goal, his intention was to get to Canaan, to Eretz Yisrael. So why does he not get there? So we don't know why he didn't get there. We can pontificate, we can suggest for those who are listening, you can share with me offline, you can put into the chat box here what your thoughts are, but this is the theme that we're sharing here this morning, which is as soon as Avram Avinu hears the word Lech Lecha is, of course, a drasha bifnei atzma. When he hears the word go, right? You're standing on the blocks, you're ready to fire away, go, ready, set, go. When he hears those words, so he knows where to go. He knows where he has to put his GPS coordinates. He rushes straight to Eretz Yisrael. He rushes right away with his direction. It was not an equivocation. It was not a conversation. There was not a committee meeting. There was no kitchen cabinet. There were no politicians or advisors to tell him or what to advise him. He knew exactly where he needs to go. Lech, all you got to tell me is where to go. As I got to go, I know exactly where to go. He goes straight to Eretz Yisrael. You know why he knows? Because that was the unfulfilled dream of his father. He knew that his father wanted to go to Eretz Canaan. And what he wants to do is he wants to pick up from where his father's legacy stops, and he wants to carry that along with him. And now he wants to take that trip to Canaan as a way of the unfulfilled dream of the father is going to be fulfilled by the settling in the land of Eretz Yisrael by the son, by Avram Avinu. In fact, the Medrash says that Avram Avinu bemoaned having to abandon his aged father. Yet there have been, yes, it's true, many mistakes. Obviously, as the pasuk tells us in Sefer Yoshua, yes, there were many mistakes in Terach's personal history. But Chazal goes so far to say that Terach did tshuva and repudiated his idolatrous past, right? Much like Ishmael, for example, even though he had one type of existence, there was something called tshuva, repentance, the tshuva of Ishmael, the tshuva of Terach, which is way, way overlooked, very infrequently studied. He's a much more complex figure than we're willing to admit. Yes, we think of him as an idolater, and he was an idolater. But what happens if he was an idolater who ultimately repudiates his idolatrous past? What happens if he does tshuva? Maybe he's yearning for spirituality. Maybe he was just yearning for spirituality, but he didn't know how to achieve spirituality. I know a lot of people that in the name of doing something spiritual, they do something completely off. It's almost like, you have coordinates that are slightly off. You send an email and you forget that little dot, blank, 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 .com or .org or whatever it is, and you leave the dot out. I have every single thing that seems to be necessary for me to send that email. That dot's left out. That email is not getting sent. You leave just one small detail out, so the email A doesn't get sent. So then you're not able to complete the task, or you drift. And even if the coordinates are seemingly slight, you're drifting, and before you know it, shazam, you're so far away. But when a person does tshuva, a person repents, this man was clearly a far more complex figure than we are willing to admit. Yes, he had an idolatrous past. Yes, we know who Yishmael was. We're going to get introduced to him now in our Parsha as well. And of course, next week's Parsha. We're going to understand all of who these personalities were. But maybe there's something else about that person. Kol HaMitzvah, all of the mitzvah, all of the personality, all of the person. Now, this approach solves another riddle as well, by the way. The idea that he's complex, the fact that he's willing to follow his father. If you think about who his father was, why is Avram Avinu so intent on taking Lot along with him? Why is he so interested in Lot's life? It's not his son, it's his nephew. What's the idea of the focus? And he's taken on kings, and he's outnumbered, and there's only 318 of them, and he's successful, he's victorious for this nephew. Lot's not his chiyuv, Lot's not his obligation. The Gemara Maseches Kiddushin Chavtes, the obligation the father has to his son, bris milah, limud Torah, v'chule, the other examples, pidyon haben, to teach a trade, all of the other examples. It's not his responsibility. It's not his obligation. And yet, as we see and as we learned, he's actually something of a troublemaker. He's in Sodom and he's living a certain type of life and so on and so forth. He's a troublemaker, right? So why does he go after him and try to save him? The reason why, one pshat, of course there are many, is that Avram Avinu takes Lot along because he's just simply following what his father did, right? Terach had taken Avram, Sarai, and who else? And Lot, on a journey that was supposed to end in Eretz Canaan. That's what the pasuk says. Vayikach Terach es Avram beno ves Lot ben Haran ben beno ves Sarai kalaso eshes Avram beno v'yetzu vitam, so on and so forth. He was supposed to take him. His father was going to take him. So it's not his responsibility. That's true. How many times do we just shirk responsibilities, shirk opportunities because it's not my responsibility? It is not my obligation. It might be technically not your obligation, but what would happen if you just took responsibility just because of another reason? Here in this case, he's a troublemaker. He's difficult. He has interests that require Avraham and even his nephew to separate from each other. In the beginning of our Parsha, we learn about how the herdsmen are unable to commingle. They're unable to live together. You're going to choose left. I'm going to go right. You're going to choose right. I'm going to go left. We are not able to cohabit. We're not going to be able to live together. We are unable to be able to bring destiny together. He's a troublemaker. And yet, Terach takes him along this journey, which is supposed to end in Eretz Yisrael and in Canaan. And so, Avram Avinu, he finishes the mission, not just personally, but in the same way that his father had planned. And that plan included Lot. Maybe Avram Avinu didn't want to take Lot. Maybe he thought that he was a troublemaker, but it didn't matter because if he's carrying the legacy of his father, and if his father felt there was enough significance and importance for him to bring Lot along for the ride. You have a difficult family member and you don't want to invite them to the holiday party. You don't want to invite them for Shabbos. You don't feel like connecting to them or reaching out to them. You know something? Maybe from Avram Avinu, we have an obligation to do that. You have to pick up the phone and say, I'm going to invite you anyway because you belong in my family. And it's because of the fact, if it was important to that family member, my grandma of blessed memory, she used to be in touch with all of the cousins and everybody would call her and so on and so forth. And now I often feel that I have that same responsibility, not necessarily because you're so close to people, but because if that was important to the generation previous, it should be something that's of value. Maybe what we understand from here is that he takes Lot along for the ride. He finds an unbelievable amount of interest in Lot simply because his father took interest in Lot, because his father wanted to take him to Canaan. Now, Avram Avinu, he finishes the mission. It's not just personal, but it's in the same manner that his father planned it. And that plan includes Lot. Now, let's understand and think about our original thought here. Had Terach been a terrible person, the way we tend to assume him to be, so when Avram Avinu is given the command, go, the concept of Lech, Lecha, so what would we have known to have happened? If he would have been a terrible influence, he would have been a bad man, a Rasha Merusha, most likely is that Avram Avinu would have headed in precisely the opposite direction from his father, right? Maybe physically and maybe figuratively, but it would seem to be that if this man is so bad, how many people do we know that we just want to cross the street when we see them? We want to have nothing to do with them. We want to have zero interaction with that person. If he was such a bad person, he was such a bad person. So why is it that he doesn't go in a completely opposite direction from his father? But in point of fact, Terach perhaps had begun to blaze a trail toward Eretz Yisrael long before Avram Avinu's divine command, right? And that's what he saw. Maybe that's what he was raised with. Maybe he saw the tshuva. Maybe he felt the repentance. Maybe he heard about spirituality, which was, even though it was not the correct way, initially, clearly, worshiping idols, but then the coordinates were put in the right direction. What's the right direction? East. meaning to Eretz Yisrael. And so therefore he begins this path to blaze a trail toward Eretz Yisrael long before Lech Lecha mi'artzecha. And clearly what we understand from this is that Avraham Avinu felt attached to his father. And not only was he attached to his father, but he even strove to emulate his father. He wanted to finish the job of his father. He wanted to carry on the baton. He wanted to be able to pass it along. He wanted to do the job, finish the mission. You see, I think that it's so easy for us at times to fixate on one story or one representation, or to formulate an entire series of judgments founded on the strength of a single impression. It's true that there's nothing like the first impression. You can't get back that first impression. But sometimes what happens is that people do things, they say things, they act in ways that they shouldn't. That impression, so it's embedded in the way sometimes we think of those people, l'olam va'ed. It's embedded in the way people think of us. But what we understand from this, from a line in a medrash or a pasuk, from the Navi, we see is that we're capable of writing whole scripts or painting entire images in our mind, right? Little Avram was in the shop of his father, and there's idols that he's smashing. It's true. That is an unfavorable part of the story of Terach's life. That is not disputable. But sometimes what happens is this one line, or as a pasuk in Navi, which Yoshua, it's written here in Sefer Yoshua, Perek Chavdal, pasuk Beis, because it has to be written there. It's telling the history of our people. No question, it's undisputed. But is that the whole story? If it's the whole story, then that literally negates the whole notion of change, the whole concept of tshuva, the whole idea where a person can renew themselves, where a person can be different. And if you can be different, so somebody else can also be different. And if you want somebody to think of you differently, then somebody else deserves that same very right to be thought of as differently as well. We are capable of writing whole scripts, painting whole pictures, casting aspersions, making conclusions about people based on single sentences, single encounters, which sometimes, just sometimes, we don't even know the whole story of that whole encounter. What we see is just a little drop, a little minuscule amount of what that whole story ultimately is. And without seeing the whole thing, we're left to the imagery for which we paint pictures about people which are not correct. If only we would give the same level of credence to the small baby steps that people make towards change, towards perfecting, towards bettering themselves, and open that up just as wide as we open the gap of people's misgivings and short sights. The same way we open those things up and cast final conclusional thoughts about those people, so too we should likewise rip that open and likewise see the positive in people's change. And so ever so subtly, what we understand is that Avraham Avinu reminds us right from the beginning, Lech Lecha, not only that we should be deliberate in judgment, as the Mishnah Perkei Avos tells us, but that we should never fall into the trap of pigeonholing or stigmatizing another human being on the basis of one experience or one mistake. This is true in the world of politics. This is true in the world of family. This is true in the world of shalom bayis with children. This is true in the world of colleagues and how we interact with people that we work with. This is true of how we interact with the world. Don't pigeonhole or stigmatize. Be open-minded. Be open and willing to understand or explore definitions that might be a little different than the way you thought of things as they must be. Halacha, it's Torah Halacha Moshe Misinai. This is indisputed. And the answer is maybe it's disputed. Maybe it's different. Maybe if you sat down and had such a conversation, maybe if it wasn't so, with so much vitriol and so much hatred and so much disdain in the world of chaos and upheaval, maybe it would be just different in the ability to be able to find commonality. Yes, there are distinctions always. There are multiple opinions always. But our inability to coexist with people of multiple opinions or different opinions from ours, it has reached an unmistakably low level that we have to try to dial back up in a positive sense. And it happens not when we just sit back on our laurels and just say, oh, this is the crazy world that we live in. Look at the political climate. Look at this and look at that. No. What are you doing to make the world a different place? How are you extending your hand to hear the other side, to not necessarily change your opinion, but to be open-minded and just building relationships, building bridges, building roadways and pathways for people to coexist together, despite the fact that sometimes there's situations we just cannot see the world the same way. Human beings on the basis of even one experience, one mistake, or one positivity. We love to think of Avraham as the champion of openness and the paradigm of what it means to care deeply about outsiders, right? We think about Abraham's tent, open on all four sides, and going to bat for, the most dastardly citizens and people of Sodom. And if there's 45 and there's 40 and there's 35 and there's 30 and there's 25 and he's fighting for who? He's not fighting for the Rashka Bahag. He's fighting for the Beis Medrash. Who's he fighting for? He's fighting for the people that live in Sodom. And even if there's a little bit of righteousness, if you're righteous, what are you doing in Sodom? And the answer is you can even live in Sodom and maybe there's a righteousness. Now, maybe there wasn't. Clearly there wasn't. But Avraham Avinu is willing to fight for, and Moshe Rabbeinu is willing to fight for even the dastardly people for whom are maybe sometimes even our brothers and sisters. But long before this, Avraham Avinu was busy defending the weak. Before he's busy defending the weak and welcoming the stranger, as we have to emulate, he reveals the degree to which he honored the life and the dream of someone very much on the inside, but someone to whom we would otherwise pay very little attention. He paid attention and honors the dream of his father, Terach. You see, if indeed our view is broad enough, if we're open-minded enough, then we'll be able to say with pride that we are heirs to the legacy bequeathed to us by Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu gave us that ability. He gave us the ability to see outside of, sometimes beneath the veneer of what's presented as something very negative. When a person's negative, they're negative. Yes, you cross the street and you go in a different direction. But when there's a chance not only to be connected to feel committed towards, but then to take the mission of Terach the way Avraham Avinu did, it's extraordinary. That's extraordinary. We could say with pride that we are the heirs of an incredible person who, yes, the tent, the stranger, the welcoming, all of that, that's for sure what he's known for. Emes, Titan Emes Yaakov, Chesed Lavram, Chesed of Avraham Avinu, the loving kindness, the welcoming, the Achnasas Orchim. But maybe there's something else. And that's this something else that we're learning about his relationship with Terach. But we'll end this with how we began. It really is all about finishing the job. And if you yourself can't finish the job because of circumstances that have come, that have impeded your path, so then you're exempt. But if there's situations that have been self-inflicted as to which you are unable to finish the job because of what you have not put in place to be able to finish the job, so we should reflect and think deeply about why that's so. To finish the job of those who came before us, to finish the job of those who have put in our strong hands to be able to bring the destiny and the narrative of the Jewish people to its place. We are not just meant to be bystanders or in the sidelines or in the bleachers of this beautiful place called life. If you see a problem, fix it. Don't comment on the problem. Be the solution to the problem. Take extreme ownership of the things that are dastardly and low and need to be changed. Those things that are coward, divisive, those things that bring people far. Be the one who brings people close. Create the opportunities to bring people together. Finish the job of the people that have come before us that want so much for us to not talk about building Beis HaMikdash, not to talk about Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, but to do it. And if not now, when? And if at the very least we struggle, that might be the very first step in ultimately being able to figure out how we can get to the promised land. It's true about finishing the task and bringing Avraham Avinu, his descendants, to Eretz Yisrael, because that's what his father wanted. It's true about ourselves thinking about Eretz Yisrael, but it's true about all mitzvos. Whether it's the Atzmos Yosef, Kvuras Yisrael, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, or anything in between, anything and everything. When you put yourself and your mind to completing a task, complete the task. Don't let things stand in your way. As Tafshin Pei Aleph just started, we're at the very beginning. All of those thoughts that we had to truly this year be different. I'm going to study Torah on a different level. I'm going to learn how to read Hebrew on a different level. I'm going to connect to my brothers and sisters by being sensitive and empathetic and being charismatic in the sense of trying to be a goyim el chesed. I'm going to try to do what I can that I said that I was going to do. Now we're just a month past the high holidays, a little bit more than that. What is your plan? What is it that we are doing? So if we think about this, finishing the task, we know that the reward is given to the one who completes the task, not the person who starts it unless there's extenuating circumstances. Let's not be caught in that trap. Let's finish the task. Let's learn from Avram Avinu who finished the task of his father. Let's finish the task even of the people, those who we don't necessarily see or think have any redeeming qualities about them. That's not what Avram Avinu thought, not about the strangers, not about the wayfarers, not by the travelers, but even about his own father, even from that which was within, something so deeply personal. And when we'll be able to do that, we will win World Series and championships and be crowned world leaders, world champions. And in so doing, we'll Mekadesh Shem Shemayim Berabim. It should be a mitzvah Hashem. We should have the strength to do so, and to do so to bring glory to the Rebbeinu Shalom Keni Yiratzon V'Nomar. Amen. I thank you all for joining me here this morning in the Zoom room. Be on our other portals of learning together. Let's be inspired others along the way. Please God in doing so. And I wish everybody a beautiful day. And I wish you all a wonderful, uplifted, and a beautiful Shabbos Kodesh.